Okay, and welcome back. We're here today to talk about supervision. We're moving on to quality instruction and observation. This is session 4. I want to start with this quote about monitoring, and I think it's important that you understand that whatever it is that the supervisors focus on is where the attention goes. And I equate that to the same as teaching. If you were to give a homework assignment and never collect it or never give feedback to your students, they might stop doing it. So as administrators, there's certain things that you focus on or that they focus on, and that's how we know where they have their values. So when we're thinking about instruction, we need to think about what quality instruction is, which is our first question, and then how exactly do you know when you see it? So that might be something that you want to think about and reflect on, and think about what your administrators or leaders tell you in terms of how they impress their values on what they want to see in day-to-day instruction. So one of the tools that I find very helpful is the sequence chain. So we want to have a series of events and planning, and that begins with the backward mapping. It's important for me to communicate to you what quality instruction is, because if you're going to be observing it and giving feedback, we have to have a common understanding and a common definition of what it is. So it begins with backward mapping, which is begin with the end in mind. You want to look at your lesson indicator and also consider what type of summative assessment will be used to assess that particular indicator or those indicators. Then from that, you want to look at daily objectives, which are aligned to your indicators, and then after each daily objective, you have some type of formative assessment that measures the objective. This could be your entire unit with your lesson indicator, and then that maps into a certain number of daily objectives to get accomplished what you're trying to cover. Certainly throughout any given effective lesson, you want to have ongoing assessment so that you have a direct measure of what your students are able to do and demonstrate. And it's equally important if they do demonstrate progress towards an indicator, just as well as if they cannot, and you need to make adjustments to your instruction. So when we look at components of effective instruction, these are the ones that come to mind for me. You have an objective, you have your summative assessment, which is your long-range goal. You have independent, individual, formative assessment. No longer do we just ask one student one question and assume the whole class has mastered it. We look at alignment of the standards, Common Core, and then the PARCC assessment. Evidence of reading and writing, certainly quality lessons have before, during, and after reading strategies. You want to have your students responsible for their learning. You want to consider differentiation, UDL, also technology that supports the instruction. When you're looking at the objective, you want to consider how the objective is moving learning toward the indicator. We also want a connection to the subsequent and previous lessons, and you want that to be clearly communicated to the students. In assessment, you want to have a connection with your summative, looking at the long-range learning that's in the indicator, and then some tidbits for formative assessment. As I said earlier, you want it to be independent. It's nice if you can have sample responses. You should share scoring tools with your students, and you know that there's a connection, how the formative assessment is going to get them to the summative. Activities, again, should have alignment and be connected. You want to consider explicitly teaching the skill or concept before the students have to actually do it on their own. Modeling comes into play, providing feedback, practice. Again, reading and writing. You want to have engaging activities. You want it to be differentiated, student-centered, and again, making students responsible for their learning. Bloom's taxonomy is a great way to think about the rigor and what you're covering in a course and in a lesson, starting with knowledge and comprehension on the lower end, application and analysis in the middle, and then the highest rigor is your synthesis and evaluation. I'm going to skip the next slides because that's just a review of Bloom's, and you can use that at your leisure. These are nice because they have questions that help you write objectives and to frame questions when you're thinking about the level and the rigor in your lesson. I also want to talk a little bit about, as we move to observation, this is known as the clinical supervision model, and this is direct assistance. So if you think back to the tasks that we talked about at the beginning of the course, direct assistance, the idea behind observation is to give each teacher the one-on-one professional development so that they can grow as an educator. So that's done under the clinical supervision model that has these steps. So the first step should be some type of pre-conference with the teacher in which you set goals and you establish the purpose and parameters for the observation. In elementary schools, this is usually with the assistant principal or the principal. In secondary schools, it may be with the principal or assistant principal. Many times it's with a lead teacher or a department chair, depending on the school system in which you work and what the leadership model is. After the pre-conference with the teacher, the observation takes place and the observer records the information that took place during the lesson. After the observation, the observer must analyze and make a determination on what actually took place in the lesson, and then determine the conference approach in terms of the leadership style, which you've explored a lot of leadership style examples in the previous weeks. So at this point, you're now thinking of working with the teacher. Are you going to be more directive? Maybe they are a new teacher and you need to explicitly tell them where they need to be and what they need to do in the lesson. Are you more collaborative, which is give and take between the teacher and the supervisor? Or you could be more non-directive because it's a veteran teacher and they've really analyzed the lesson and you're just supporting them as they move forward in their growth. Then you conduct your post-conference with the teacher. You go through the evidence and you analyze the lesson with them. Then you go back through to look at steps 1 through 4 to analyze how you thought it went and any adjustments you might make. Then when we get to observing skills, this is chapter 13 in Glickman in either the 9th or 10th edition, but just look up observing skills. So observing is actually a 2-part process. You want to describe what is seen, so you want to record that carefully, and then you're making your interpretation. So children are out of their seats, children are talking, time is passing, and there's not quality instruction would be an observation. Then the interpretation is that there might not be a structure, there might not be a routine, there might not be positive classroom management. But initially you're just tracking all of the information. Then we look at formative versus summative instruments. A formative would be described as just taking place, writing down what's going on in the class, and looking at whether that's consistent with the teacher and the supervisor are focusing on. A lot of times mentors give formative feedback, sometimes department chairs if they're non-evaluative, or maybe they're just doing a drop-in, sometimes even administrators. The intent is to provide information to the teacher based on what they're looking at, and in this case, formative. This is how Glickman, the textbook author, defines it. Competence is not an issue. Then you want to have your descriptive finding, and then that could be chosen between the teacher and the supervisor. What generally happens in most schools today, however, is that this information, formative, also gets connected to some type of evaluative feedback, because I think most administrators just don't have the time to make all the formative checks. So they're looking, and if there's a problem, then they're going forward to support the teacher, and if things are validated, they're counting that as well. In the summative instrument, according to Glickman, it's externally imposed, uniformly applied, meaning generally this is decided upon by the teachers' union and the leadership in the school system, and then you want a consistent application. and that does connect with judging the teachers on a certain criteria, hence your evaluation or rating in an observation. It definitely is connected to competence, and in some systems around the state, there's merit pay connection. Summarize and judge competence. You're familiar with this rating scale checklist, and that is generally dictated to the teacher and the supervisor. It's nothing discussed or chosen. Now, the next paper, follow-up 2, you will be working on a quantitative observation, and then in follow-up 3, you'll be doing qualitative with some pieces of quantitative. This will be a more holistic view. So in the terms of the quantitative, we're going to think about categorical frequency instruments, performance indicators, visual diagramming. I'm going to skip qualitative for now and come back to that. So I'm going to change slideshows for a minute, if you bear with me. And we're going to look at observing skills. So these are out of the book, Chapter 13 again, and I want you to be thinking about what supervisory skills are needed to collect the data that will enhance instruction. So that's going to be you as you go forward in these 2 papers. So it is something to think about. As we move forward, 2 key terms for observation: describe what is seen, and then make an interpretation as to what it actually means. Formative observation we discussed. They're not summative evaluation. That's just collecting the data. Then we talked about quantitative observation, and these you can read more about in the Glickman text. Categorical frequency might be something like looking at the number of questions that are asked, the levels of questions, tracking on a seating chart exactly who answers which questions in the class. Performance indicator instruments might be some type of numerical, such as a lab, seeing what students can do what part of the lab, what students can answer certain questions about vocabulary, let's say it's world language, or let's say in physical education, demonstrating a certain number of skills would be by their performance. Visual diagramming is another quantitative observation tool. Maybe in an art class, you're tracking the movement of students, who gets up, who's moving to each table, where the teacher is going. Does the teacher make it around to each table to support each student? Or maybe the teacher gets caught one part of the room. Or same in a regular traditional classroom, let's say English, maybe the teacher hovers around the front of the room, never addresses behaviors that are going on in the middle and the back of the room. So these are all quantitative because there's some type of numerical connection to the data that you're collecting. Qualitative we will come back to, but these are all covered at more length in the textbook. Tailored system. If you can't decide which one that you want to use, you might have a tailored system in which you can design it the way you would like. This is another question response instrument, and you can see this is essentially a seating chart, and there's a code here. Correct response is a plus, a circle is feedback, a minus is incorrect. But if you then tabulated any of this data, you would see quickly that this would become a quantitative measure. So here we could also talk with the teacher that Steve and Joanna never participated, Becky had no interaction. You could look at John, who had a lot of teacher prompting, 1 positive. Roberta and Beth had 2 positives. So you can talk about where the teacher is getting around. No teacher interaction in some of the rooms, in some of the boxes where there's no arrows or teacher prompting. Same thing here. If you're monitoring behavior and response, you could roll this into a quantifiable document looking at the running time, what's happening, and positive and negative consequences. This is a nice graphic because it shows you the quantitative measures that are covered, also the qualitative, and then the role of the observer. Again, this is out of Chapter 13 in the text. collaborative walkthroughs, some background information,